The spa was supposed to be a place of calm, a sanctuary where the world's noise faded and people could breathe, relax, and reset. That's why she was there. She'd worked hard all week, balancing work, family, and life's endless demands. Her spa days weren't a luxury, they were survival. Walking through the serene lobby with its soft music and lavender-scented air, she felt her shoulders begin to relax. She smiled politely at the receptionist and checked in, already looking forward to the hot stones and deep tissue massage she'd booked weeks ago. But calm turned to chaos in an instant. It started with a look sharp, scrutinizing, and so direct it couldn't be ignored. The woman sitting in the corner of the waiting area had her phone out, pretending to scroll, but her eyes never left the target. She leaned toward another guest and whispered something, and they both glanced her way. At first, she tried to brush it off. Maybe she was imagining it. Maybe it was nothing. But the look came again, bolder this time. It pierced through her like an accusation she couldn't quite place. She adjusted her robe, glanced around the room, and tried to focus on the soft music playing overhead. But the tension in the air was undeniable. A shadow loomed as the woman, blonde, mid-50s, and dressed in an outfit far too formal for a spa, stood and approached her. The room seemed to hold its breath. "Excuse me," the woman said, her tone laced with something that felt anything but polite. "Do you even belong here?" The words were like a slap, cutting through the quiet space and sending ripples of unease across the room. Heads turned. Eyebrows raised. A hush fell over the small crowd as everyone waited to see what would happen next. She froze, unsure if she'd heard correctly. "I'm sorry?" she said, her voice calm but edged with confusion. "You heard me," the woman snapped, her eyes narrowing. "This is a private establishment. We don't usually get people like you here." There it was. The unspoken accusation hanging heavy in the air, unmasked now for all to see. She could feel every gaze in the room, some curious, some sympathetic, and others clearly siding with the woman who had decided to make this her business. Taking a slow breath, she straightened her posture and met the woman's gaze head-on. "I'm a paying customer, just like you," she said evenly. The woman scoffed, her hands flying to her hips in dramatic disbelief. "We'll see about that." She spun on her heel, marching toward the front desk with the kind of determination that only comes when someone feels entitled to control a situation. The receptionist, young and visibly flustered, looked up from her computer as the woman began her tirade. "I don't think she belongs here," she declared, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Are you even checking who comes into this place? You can't just let anyone in." Her words hung heavy in the room, each syllable a weapon designed to wound. The receptionist glanced nervously at the woman, then at the target of her accusation, clearly unsure how to respond. But before anyone could speak, another voice cut through the tension. "Is there a problem here?" It was the spa manager, calm yet authoritative, stepping into the fray with an air of control. All eyes turned to him, the room waiting to see who he'd address, what he'd say, and whether justice or something else entirely would prevail. As the scene unfolded, it became clear that what started as a trip to unwind would become something much bigger. Something that would leave everyone in the room questioning what they thought they knew about fairness, decency, and truth. "What happens next will leave you stunned." The spa manager stood tall, his calm demeanor masking the weight of the situation. His eyes scanned the room quickly, taking in the woman's furious stance and the calm but tense expression of the accused guest. The other patrons watched in silence, their spa robes and slippers contrasting sharply with the thick air of unease. "Ma'am," he said, addressing the irate woman with professional politeness, "can you explain what seems to be the issue?" "She doesn't belong here," the woman said, her voice rising as she pointed an accusatory finger. "This is a luxury spa. I pay good money to come here, and I expect a certain standard." The manager's expression didn't waver. He turned his gaze to the woman in question, his voice steady. "Ma'am, have you checked in already?" "Yes," she said, her tone calm but firm, as if she refused to let herself be rattled. "I checked in 20 minutes ago. My appointment is for 11:30. The manager nodded and turned back to the receptionist, who was still frozen behind the desk. "Can you confirm that, please?" The receptionist's fingers shook as she clicked through the booking system, clearly flustered by the intensity of the moment. After a beat, she looked up, her voice soft but clear. "Yes, she's checked in. She has a massage scheduled." A hush fell over the room. The woman's accusation hung there, exposed for what it was, an assumption, based on nothing but prejudice. But she wasn't ready to back down. "Well, I find it hard to believe," the woman snapped. "People don't just walk into places like this without raising some eyebrows." "People?" the accused woman asked, her voice steady but sharp. "What exactly do you mean by that?" The question lingered, direct and cutting through the facade of politeness. The spa manager cleared his throat, stepping in before things escalated further. "Ma'am," he said to the accuser, his tone firmer now, "I assure you, all our guests are treated with the same level of respect and care. If you have concerns, we can discuss them privately. Otherwise, I'd ask that you enjoy your visit and allow others to do the same." The woman's face reddened, but she seemed to realize she was losing her audience. The quiet murmurs of the other guests carried a tone of disapproval, and she could feel the weight of their judgment turning against her. With a huff, she muttered something under her breath and stormed off toward the locker room, her heels clicking sharply against the tile floor. The tension in the room began to dissolve, but the unease lingered. The manager turned to the guest who had been the target of the accusation, his expression softening. "I'm very sorry for what just happened," he said. "If there's anything we can do to make your visit more comfortable, please let us know." She nodded, offering a polite but distant smile. "Thank you," she said. The moment should have ended there, but it didn't. As she moved to sit back down, she could feel the weight of lingering stares. Some were sympathetic, but others were curious, even doubtful. It was as if the seeds of suspicion planted by the woman had taken root in the room, spreading silently. She tried to focus on her breathing, grounding herself as the soothing music played overhead. But her mind kept replaying the moment, the way the woman had looked at her, the sharpness of her words, the way no one had immediately stepped in to shut it down. It wasn't the first time something like this had happened. She knew what it felt like to be questioned, to be doubted, to be treated as though she didn't belong. But there was something about this incident that felt different, heavier, as though it was just the beginning of something much larger. The massage therapist called her name a few minutes later, breaking her from her thoughts. She followed them down the hallway, trying to shake off the lingering discomfort. The room was warm and inviting, the scent of eucalyptus filling the air. She lay down on the table, hoping the tension in her body would melt away. But even as the therapist worked, the weight in her chest refused to budge. She kept thinking about the woman, about the way she had marched to the front desk as if her assumptions were facts. And she wondered what gave people like that the confidence to act with such certainty. Meanwhile, in the locker room, the woman was still fuming. She paced back and forth, muttering to herself about standards and respect. But beneath her anger was something else, an uneasiness she couldn't quite name. She'd expected everyone to agree with her, to validate her concerns, but instead, she'd felt the sting of judgment turn back on her. The other guests, now left to their own thoughts, began to whisper amongst themselves. Some defended the accused woman, calling out the blatant unfairness of the situation. Others weren't so sure. "I mean, why did she get so defensive?" one patron murmured to another. "If she had nothing to hide." The conflict had planted doubts in all directions, leaving the air thick with unspoken questions. And somewhere, just out of sight, the truth waited to be uncovered. As the massage therapist worked through the knots in her back, she tried to focus on the soothing rhythm of the strokes, the calming warmth of the room, and the soft music playing overhead. But no matter how hard she tried, the words from earlier kept echoing in her mind. Do you even belong here? It wasn't the first time she'd faced such a question. The sting was familiar, but that didn't make it any easier to swallow. She couldn't help but wonder how many others in that room had silently agreed with the woman, even if they hadn't said it out loud. Were they now questioning her, doubting her right to be in the same space as them? The thought made her stomach tighten. Meanwhile, in another part of the spa, the accuser had taken her frustration to the staff lounge. She cornered another employee, venting about how she just knew something was off. You can't just ignore your instincts, she said, her voice low but insistent. People like her always find a way to slip through the cracks. The employee nodded politely but didn't engage, clearly uncomfortable. It was easier to let the woman ramble than to risk challenging her. But as the words sank in, the staff member began to feel the weight of complicity. Was staying silent the same as agreeing? Back in the massage room, the woman being accused tried to distract herself with memories of why she'd come to the spa in the first place. She thought of her best friend, who had gifted her the appointment as a birthday surprise. You need this, her friend had said, practically dragging her to the front desk to book the session weeks ago. You deserve to feel cared for, even if it's just for a couple of hours. She smiled faintly at the memory, grateful for the gesture, but the peaceful feeling was short-lived. The therapist's voice broke through her thoughts. Are you okay? They asked gently. You seem a little tense. She hesitated before answering. I'm fine, she lied, not wanting to unload her troubles on a stranger. Just a lot on my mind. The therapist nodded and continued working, but their eyes lingered on her for a moment longer, sensing that there was more to the story. In the lounge area, the tension hadn't fully dissipated. Some of the spa guests who had witnessed the earlier confrontation were still quietly debating what had happened. One woman leaned over to her friend and whispered she handled herself so well. I don't think I could have stayed that calm if someone said that to me. Another guest, less sympathetic, chimed in. But why not just show some proof? A receipt or something? If it were me, I'd want to clear things up immediately. The conversations revealed the unspoken divides in the room. Some were appalled by the accuser's actions, while others seemed more willing to entertain her doubts. The incident had sparked something deeper, exposing biases and assumptions that many hadn't even realized they carried. In the staff office, the spa manager sat at his desk, reviewing security footage from the lobby. He wasn't just checking to ensure the accused guest had checked in properly, he knew that much was true. But something about the confrontation had unsettled him. He wanted to understand how it had escalated so quickly, why the woman had felt emboldened to make such a public accusation. As he watched the footage, he noticed something strange. The accuser had been sitting in the waiting area for nearly 20 minutes before the accused woman had even arrived. She'd been on her phone, glancing up occasionally, seemingly bored but calm. But the moment the other woman entered, her demeanor changed. She straightened in her chair, her eyes narrowing, her fingers tapping impatiently on her phone. It was as if she'd been waiting for a reason to act. The manager leaned back in his chair, troubled by the pattern he was beginning to see. He knew he needed to address the situation with care, but the more he thought about it, the more complicated it seemed. Elsewhere in the spa, a young staff member who had overheard part of the confrontation earlier couldn't shake the unease they felt. They'd grown up hearing stories about incidents like this, moments where people's biases were laid bare, often with devastating consequences. Now, witnessing it firsthand, they felt a mix of anger and helplessness. They debated whether to speak up, to tell the manager what they'd seen and heard, but a part of them hesitated. Would it make a difference? Would anyone listen? The accused woman finished her massage and stepped back into the lounge, feeling marginally better but still carrying the weight of the morning's events. She noticed the glances, the whispers that abruptly stopped as she passed by. Her skin prickled with awareness, but she refused to let it show. She sat down, picking up a magazine from the table in front of her, pretending to read. But her mind was elsewhere, replaying the incident over and over, trying to understand why it had happened and what she could have done differently. The spa, once a haven of peace and relaxation, now felt like a battlefield. Every interaction, every glance, every whispered word seemed loaded with meaning. And as the day unfolded, it became clear that the confrontation was only the beginning. The ripple effects of that moment would reach further than anyone in the room could have imagined. The spa had grown quieter as the day wore on, but the tension still lingered in the air, unspoken yet palpable. She sat in the relaxation lounge, her magazine untouched in her lap. The incident earlier had left a mark she couldn't shake, and no amount of calming music or eucalyptus scent could wash it away. She considered leaving, skipping the second half of her session and heading home. But something about walking away felt like letting the other woman win, like giving up her space in a place where she had every right to be. She straightened her posture, lifting her chin slightly. No. She wasn't going anywhere. In the locker room, the accuser was still stewing. She paced back and forth, her phone in hand, typing furiously. She wasn't ready to let it go, not after feeling so publicly undermined. People need to know, she muttered to herself, opening her social media app. She began typing a post, carefully crafting her words to portray herself as the victim of a situation she had started. But her words didn't go unnoticed. Another guest, who had stepped into the locker room to grab her towel, saw the woman's furious typing and overheard bits of her muttering. "People like that ruin everything," the woman said, her voice just loud enough for others to hear. The guest hesitated, torn between confronting the woman and staying out of it. She thought about what she had witnessed earlier, about how unfair and unprovoked the accusation had been. But the woman's confidence, her righteous indignation, made it hard to push back. She decided to leave the locker room without saying anything, but as she walked away, guilt gnawed at her. She couldn't help but wonder if her silence made her complicit. Back in the lounge, the young staff member who had witnessed the earlier incident had finally worked up the courage to speak to the manager. They knocked softly on his office door, stepping inside when he waved them in. "I just wanted to say something about what happened earlier," they began, their voice tentative. "I don't think it was right, the way she spoke to that guest." The manager looked up, his expression serious but open. "Go on," he said. The staff member explained what they had seen and heard, their words tumbling out in a rush. They described the accuser's behavior before and after the incident, the way she had seemed determined to find fault where there was none. The manager listened carefully, nodding occasionally. When they finished, he leaned back in his chair, his brow furrowed in thought. "Thank you for telling me," he said. "This kind of behavior doesn't align with what we stand for here. I'll handle it." But the staff member wasn't sure what handling it would mean. Would he talk to the accuser? Apologize again to the guest who had been targeted? Or would it all be swept under the rug, the way these things often were? In the relaxation lounge, she noticed the glances starting up again, subtle but undeniable. Two women sitting across the room were whispering, their eyes flicking toward her before darting away. She felt the weight of their assumptions, the unspoken judgments, and it made her chest tighten. Deciding she needed a moment to herself, she stood and walked toward the tea station at the far end of the room. As she poured herself a cup, she heard a voice behind her. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry about what happened earlier." She turned to see the guest who had overheard the accuser in the locker room. The woman looked genuinely uncomfortable, as if she wasn't used to speaking up but felt compelled to say something. "Thank you," she replied, her voice soft. "It means a lot." The woman hesitated, then added, "I heard her talking in the locker room just now. She's posting about it online. She's making it sound like." She trailed off, unsure how to finish the sentence. Her stomach dropped. Making it sound like what? Like she was the one being wronged, the woman said quietly. The weight of the situation hit her all over again. It wasn't just a personal attack anymore, it was something bigger, something that could spiral out of control. She thought about how quickly stories spread online, how easily truth could be twisted into something unrecognizable. She thanked the woman and walked back to her seat, her mind racing. She wanted to believe it would blow over, that the other woman's post would go unnoticed. But deep down, she knew better. Meanwhile, the manager had decided to speak with the accuser directly. He found her near the steam room, her phone still in hand, her expression smug. "Ma'am," he said, his tone polite but firm, "can we talk for a moment?" She turned to him, clearly annoyed by the interruption. "What is it now?" "I understand you've been upset about the situation earlier," he began, choosing his words carefully. "But I want to make it clear that we don't tolerate discrimination here. Every guest is treated equally, and that includes respecting their right to enjoy our facilities without harassment." Her eyes narrowed. "Are you accusing me of something?" "I'm asking you to consider the impact of your words and actions," he replied evenly. "We want everyone to feel welcome here." The woman's face flushed with anger, but before she could respond, another staff member approached, whispering something in the manager's ear. His expression shifted, his brow furrowing in concern. "I'll be back to discuss this further," he told the woman before walking away quickly. In his office, the staff member who had spoken up earlier was holding a tablet, showing the manager the accuser's social media post. It was already gaining traction, with comments and shares piling up. The post painted her as a hero for calling out suspicious behavior, and included just enough vague details to stir controversy without naming names. The manager's jaw tightened. He knew the situation was spiraling out of control, and if he didn't act quickly, it could have serious consequences for everyone involved. The spa, once a place of calm and tranquility, now felt like the center of a storm, with tensions mounting and everyone bracing for what would come next. The spa manager stared at the screen, his face a mask of controlled frustration. The post was spreading quickly, attracting a flood of comments, some in support of the accuser's narrative, others questioning her version of events. It was clear that the situation had escalated beyond the walls of the spa, and now the reputation of his establishment was at risk. But more importantly, so was the dignity of an innocent guest. He took a deep breath and decided he couldn't let this continue unchecked. He called the accused guest to his office. When she arrived, her expression was wary, but she stood tall, her resolve unbroken. "I want to apologize again for what happened," the manager began, his voice earnest. "And I also want you to know we're taking this seriously. The other guest has posted about the incident online, and while I can't control her actions, I can ensure that the truth is made clear here and now." Her heart sank at the mention of the post, but she nodded. "What do you need from me?" she asked. "We have security footage of the lobby," he said. "It's clear from the video that you checked in properly and followed all our procedures. I'd like your permission to share this with our legal team and, if necessary, publicly to counter her claims." She hesitated. The thought of her image being shared, of her becoming part of a larger public spectacle, was daunting. But she also knew how damaging unchecked lies could be. After a moment, she nodded. "If it helps set the record straight, do it." The manager thanked her, promising to handle the situation with care. As she left the office, she felt a mix of relief and apprehension. The truth was on her side, but the idea of fighting this battle so publicly was exhausting. Meanwhile, the accuser, unaware of the manager's actions, continued to revel in the attention her post was receiving. But the tone of the comments had begun to shift. Some users were asking for proof, questioning the vague details in her story. Others were pointing out inconsistencies in her account. The cracks in her narrative were beginning to show, but she refused to back down. The next morning, the spa issued a carefully worded statement on its social media platforms. Without naming names, it addressed the incident, reaffirming the spa's commitment to inclusivity and respect. The statement included a brief explanation of the security footage, confirming that the accused guest had been fully compliant with all check-in procedures. The post was met with a wave of support, but it also drew more attention to the accuser's original claims. Under increasing scrutiny, she doubled down, posting another message accusing the spa of covering for questionable behavior. But the twist came when one of the spa's regular guests, someone who had been sitting quietly in the lounge during the initial confrontation, came forward. They posted their own account of the incident, describing what they had seen and heard. Their detailed narrative painted a starkly different picture, one that aligned with the spa's statement and highlighted the accuser's aggressive behavior. The accuser's credibility crumbled almost overnight. People began digging into her online history, uncovering a pattern of similar accusations in other public spaces. It became clear that this wasn't an isolated incident but part of a troubling pattern. The accused woman watched the fallout from a distance, grateful that the truth had emerged but shaken by how close she had come to being unfairly vilified. She received a personal apology from the spa manager, who offered her a complimentary membership as a gesture of goodwill. While she appreciated the offer, she declined, explaining that the experience had tainted the space for her. As the days passed, the accuser's posts disappeared, and her online presence faded. The spa moved on, taking steps to ensure such incidents wouldn't happen again. But for the woman at the center of it all, the lesson was bittersweet. The ordeal had reminded her of the strength it took to stand firm in the face of injustice, but it had also shown her how fragile trust and respect could be. And just when she thought it was over, she received a private message from someone who had been in the lounge that day. It was brief but heartfelt. "I was there," it read. "I didn't say anything when I should have. I'm sorry for not standing up for you. I'll do better next time." She stared at the message for a long time, feeling a strange mix of sadness and hope. Maybe, she thought, the real change didn't come from moments of conflict but from the quiet shifts that followed, the ones that turned witnesses into allies and silence into action. The message lingered in her mind long after she read it. It wasn't the first time someone had admitted they could have done more, but this one felt different. Maybe it was because the words carried a hint of regret, or maybe it was because they offered something rare, a promise to change. She didn't reply immediately. Instead, she sat with it, letting the weight of the experience settle. The days that followed brought a strange kind of clarity. Life moved on, as it always did, but the memory of that day at the spa stayed with her, not as a wound but as a reminder. It reminded her of how quickly things could escalate, how easily narratives could shift, and how important it was to hold on to the truth, even when it felt like the world was against you. She started reflecting on the support she'd received from unexpected places like the spa's manager, who had stepped in when it mattered most, or the guests who had come forward to share the truth. They hadn't erased the sting of what happened, but they'd shown her that not everyone stayed silent. Some people were willing to stand up, even if it took time. The experience also changed the way she moved through the world. She became more attuned to the microaggressions and biases that played out around her daily. Where she once might have brushed off a comment or a look, she now noticed them for what they were. And when she could, she spoke up not just for herself but for others who might not have found their voices yet. For the spa, the incident became a turning point. The management implemented new training programs for their staff, focusing on inclusivity and unconscious bias. They also introduced clearer policies for handling disputes, ensuring that guests would feel protected and heard. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a start. The accuser faded from the spotlight as quickly as she had entered it. Her posts were deleted, her accounts made private, and the attention she'd sought so fervently turned into something she could no longer control. Rumors swirled about her facing consequences in other parts of her life: lost friendships, strained professional relationships, but no one could say for sure. She had become a cautionary tale, a reminder of how fragile reputations could be when built on lies. The woman who had been accused, however, found herself in a different position. People reached out, friends, acquaintances, even strangers offering words of support. Some shared their own stories of similar encounters, creating a sense of solidarity she hadn't expected. It was bittersweet, knowing how many others had faced the same struggles, but it also gave her hope. If they could endure, so could she. One day, while scrolling through her messages, she came across one that stood out. It was from the young staff member at the spa who had witnessed the incident. Their words were simple but heartfelt. "I hope you know you didn't deserve any of what happened that day. I'm sorry for not doing more in the moment, but I'm learning. Thank you for being strong." She smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes. She replied, thanking them for their honesty and encouraging them to keep speaking up. It felt good to know that her experience had sparked something, however small, in someone else. Months later, she returned to the spa not as a guest but as part of a panel the management had organized to discuss diversity and inclusion. She shared her story, not to relive the pain but to show how moments of conflict could lead to growth. The room was filled with staff, guests, and members of the community, all listening intently. When she finished, the applause was loud and sustained. As she left the event, she felt a sense of closure she hadn't expected. The incident had started as a confrontation, spiraled into something bigger, and ended in a way that felt meaningful. It hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. Walking to her car, she paused for a moment, looking back at the spa. The building looked the same as it had on that first day, but everything inside felt different. She took a deep breath, feeling lighter than she had in months. Life moved on, as it always did. But now, she moved with it, carrying the lessons she'd learned and the strength she'd discovered. And in that, she found peace.